The landing signal officer aboard USS Yorktown squinted into the gathering dusk as another aircraft lined up for approach. His job was simple: guide each plane safely aboard using only handheld paddles and split-second judgment. Behind him, the carrier's deck crew waited to grab the incoming fighter and clear it for the next one. It had been a long, brutal day of combat, and everyone just wanted to get their aircraft aboard before full darkness made landing impossible. But something wasn't right about this approaching aircraft. The LSO noticed it immediately. The landing gear, it was wrong. Too wide, fixed in place instead of retractable. And the silhouette didn't match the stubby, compact shape of the Grumman F-4F Wildcats he'd been waving aboard all day. May 7th, 1942. The sun was setting over the Coral Sea, painting the western horizon in brilliant oranges and reds, while darkness spread from the east. The LSO stared at the approaching aircraft, and in the fading light, he finally saw it clearly. The distinctive red circle, the meatball insignia, painted on the fuselage. He was waving in, a Japanese dive bomber. The aircraft was already in the landing pattern, engine throttled down, flaps extended, drifting toward the deck in a perfect textbook approach. The pilot had clearly done this hundreds of times, just not on an American carrier. The LSO frantically waved his paddles in the wave-off signal, abort, abort, go around, and watched in disbelief as the Japanese pilot actually responded to the signal, ramming his throttle forward and pulling away at the last possible second. That's when Captain Elliot Buckmaster's voice crackled across the ship's intercom with an order that hadn't been heard on an American warship in decades. Stand by to repel boarders. To understand how Japanese pilots nearly landed on an American carrier, you need to understand what made the Battle of the Coral Sea unlike any naval engagement in history. For the first time ever, opposing fleets fought each other without ever coming within sight of each other. The massive battleships and cruisers that had dominated naval warfare for centuries never fired a shot. Instead, aircraft carriers, floating air bases, launched planes that fought battles hundreds of miles away, while their motherships maneuvered blindly across the ocean. The Japanese had one critical disadvantage: no radar. While USS Yorktown and USS Lexington could detect incoming aircraft at considerable distances, the Japanese carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku were operating essentially blind, relying on scout planes and visual spotting to track American forces. When Admiral Takagi launched his strike package that afternoon, dive bombers and torpedo planes sent to attack what he thought was an American cruiser group, the aircraft flew directly into an ambush. American radar had detected them coming. Grumman F-4F Wildcats, launched from the carriers, intercepted the Japanese formation miles away from their intended target. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Battle of the Coral Sea. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard this story before. And if you appreciate this level of historical detail, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The sudden appearance of American fighters scattered the carefully organized Japanese attack. Pilots broke formation, jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes to lighten their aircraft for combat maneuvering, and found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy they hadn't expected to encounter. The Japanese pilots who survived the interception faced a terrifying new problem. They were scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, their formations broken, their attack mission abandoned, and dusk was falling fast. In 1942, carrier aviation was still in its infancy. Night landings were extraordinarily dangerous, even in perfect conditions. In combat conditions, exhausted after hours of flying, With navigation equipment limited to compass and dead reckoning, finding your carrier in the dark approached the impossible. The pilots turned south, searching desperately for their carriers. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. The western sky still held some light, but darkness was spreading from the east like spilled ink. Then, through the gloom, several pilots spotted what they'd been desperately hoping to find. A flat top. The distinctive shape of an aircraft carrier was unmistakable. The long, flat deck stretching hundreds of feet. The island superstructure rising from the starboard side. Aircraft visible on deck, relief, must have flooded through those exhausted pilots. They'd made it. They were home. The pilots began entering the landing pattern, circling the carrier in the established sequence, preparing to land. Some even began signaling with blinker lights, communicating with what they believed were their own landing officers. Nobody aboard that carrier was Japanese. Bill Sergey, an aviation mechanic with VF-42 aboard Yorktown, watched the strange scene unfold from the deck. The Combat Air Patrol, American F-4F Wildcats, were expected back any minute. But these aircraft joining the landing pattern were different. There was light in the western skies, and it was dark to the east, Sergey would later recall. A group of aircraft circled the task force, sending blinker light signals that we did not recognize. This group of aircraft joined our landing pattern. The blinker lights were the first clue something was wrong. The signals didn't match American procedures. But in the chaos and exhaustion of the day's combat, with dozens of aircraft from multiple carriers operating in the same area, confusion wasn't unusual. Lieutenant Junior Grade Elbert McCuskey, a VF-42 pilot trying to find his own carrier in the gathering darkness, later described the scene. Everything was in a mess, with the Japanese planes and the American planes and the carriers all over the place. I couldn't find my carrier, so I landed on another. I saw 3 Japanese planes circling with us and thought they were part of a group from another carrier. McCuskey had actually landed aboard Yorktown and was in the ready room before someone realized those 3 aircraft circling overhead were Japanese. The first Japanese bomber began its final approach. The landing signal officer prepared to guide it aboard, paddles raised, watching the aircraft drift closer. That's when he saw the landing gear configuration. Too wide. Fixed. Wrong aircraft type. And then he saw the red circle on the fuselage. The Japanese pilot must have realized his mistake at almost the same instant the American LSO did. Perhaps he saw American aircraft markings on the deck. Perhaps the LSO's frantic wave-off signal looked different from Japanese procedures. Perhaps he simply caught a glimpse of American sailors staring up at him in shocked disbelief. Whatever triggered the realization, the pilot's reaction was immediate and instinctive. His engine, already throttled down to landing power, suddenly roared back to full thrust. The aircraft, mere seconds from touching down on Yorktown's deck, banked hard and pulled away. Behind him, the other Japanese pilots in the pattern saw their leader abort and followed suit, throttles slamming forward, aircraft banking away from the carrier. Captain Buckmaster's voice boomed across the ship's intercom. "Stand by to repel boarders." It was an order from the Age of Sail, the command given when enemy ships pulled alongside and sailors prepared to fight with cutlasses and pistols. Nobody aboard Yorktown had expected to hear those words in a modern carrier battle. But as that Japanese dive bomber screamed past the port side, its red circle insignia clearly visible in the fading light, every gunner aboard Yorktown understood exactly what repel boarders meant. Every gun on the ship opened fire. The streams of tracer fire found at least one target. The leading Japanese bomber, already committed to its approach, took multiple hits and went down. The rest scattered immediately, banking hard and diving away from the wall of anti-aircraft fire. What happened next revealed the real danger of the situation, and it wasn't the Japanese bombers that nearly landed. In the sudden confusion and near darkness, American gunners started shooting at everything in the sky. Tracer rounds lit up the evening like fireworks, streams of .50 caliber fire and 40mm shells reaching toward any aircraft silhouette. The problem was that American F-4F Wildcats were still in the landing pattern, trying to get aboard before full darkness. The American pilots suddenly found themselves flying through friendly fire from their own carrier. Ensign William Barnes managed to land despite his oil cooler being shot up by Yorktown's guns. According to witnesses, he climbed out of his cockpit, ready to fight the deck handlers, demanding to know why they were shooting at him. The chaos was complete. Japanese bombers fleeing through streams of anti-aircraft fire. American fighters trying desperately to land while their own ship shot at them. Gunners unable to distinguish friend from foe in the gathering darkness. Bill Sergey described the scene. It was like fireworks, with tracers going into any aircraft that went by. I guess they got the idea we were not theirs. It was unusual to say the least, and we were on edge. Somehow, through the wall of anti-aircraft fire, most of the Japanese pilots escaped. They scattered into the darkness, throttles wide open, banking and jinking to throw off the gunner's aim. The bombers that had nearly landed moments earlier disappeared into the night, heading south toward where they hoped their carriers would be waiting. Behind them, Yorktown gradually sorted out the chaos. American fighters were finally waved aboard, though deck handlers approached each aircraft with weapons drawn until they confirmed American markings. The last of the combat air patrol landed with their aircraft showing various degrees of damage. Some from Japanese fighters encountered earlier, others from their own carriers' guns. The surviving Japanese pilots who escaped Yorktown's guns faced a desperate flight back to their own carriers. Already low on fuel after hours of flying, they now had to find their ships in complete darkness, with no navigation aids beyond their compasses. Of the approximately 27 Japanese aircraft that had launched that morning for what should have been a straightforward attack on American cruisers, the losses were catastrophic. American fighters had shot down 9 during the initial interception. At least one more was destroyed by Yorktown's guns during the landing attempt. Then came the nightmare of night recovery. Multiple aircraft crashed into the ocean while attempting to land on their own carriers in complete darkness. Sources conflict on the exact numbers. Some records indicate only 4 aircraft successfully recovered. Others suggest as many as 18 made it back. But all agree the mission was a disaster. More than half the strike force was lost. The incident lasted perhaps 10 minutes from the moment the LSO first noticed something wrong until the last Japanese bomber disappeared into darkness. But those 10 minutes revealed something crucial about the new type of warfare being fought in the Pacific. Carrier aviation was still so new, and the distinction between friend and foe so difficult to determine in poor visibility, that even experienced pilots on both sides could become confused about whose carrier they were approaching. The Japanese pilots weren't incompetent. They were exhausted after hours of flying, combat, and navigation in deteriorating weather. They had found exactly what they were looking for, a carrier, and their training took over. Enter the pattern. Signal for landing. Follow the LSO's instructions. The American pilots were equally confused. Lieutenant McCuskey actually landed on Yorktown, thinking the Japanese planes were from another American carrier. In the chaos of the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, with aircraft from multiple ships operating in the same area, nobody was entirely sure who was who. The only reason the incident didn't end in disaster, Japanese bombers successfully landing on an American carrier, was that one landing signal officer noticed the wrong landing gear configuration. and frantically waved off an aircraft that was seconds from touching down. The near landing exposed several factors that made such confusion possible. First, aircraft silhouettes in poor light looked remarkably similar. Both American and Japanese carriers operated single-engine dive bombers with similar profiles. At dusk, with limited visibility, a Japanese Aichi D-3A Val could easily be mistaken for an American Douglas SBD Dauntless. Second, landing patterns followed similar procedures in both navies. Circle the carrier at designated altitude, wait for signal from LSO, follow instructions for approach. The Japanese pilots were following textbook procedures, just on the wrong carrier. Third, the chaos of the day's combat had scattered aircraft from multiple carriers across hundreds of miles of ocean. American pilots were landing on any friendly carrier they could find. The Japanese pilots were simply trying to do the same thing. They just miscalculated which carriers were friendly. And fourth, dusk created a perfect window of confusion. Enough light remained to spot the carrier's silhouette and attempt landing, but not enough to clearly distinguish markings or identify aircraft types until they were dangerously close. The incident demonstrated both the incredible complexity of carrier operations and how easily that complexity could lead to catastrophic mistakes. It also showed how close the Battle of the Coral Sea came, to including an even more bizarre footnote: enemy pilots successfully landing on an American carrier by mistake. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked a turning point in naval warfare. It was the first battle between aircraft carriers, the first major engagement where surface ships never fired at each other, and the first to demonstrate that air power had fundamentally changed naval combat. It was also, briefly, nearly the first battle where enemy pilots accidentally landed on each other's carriers. The incident led to immediate changes in carrier procedures. Recognition signals were tightened. Landing patterns were modified to make it harder for unauthorized aircraft to join the pattern. And most importantly, radar operators were given explicit instructions to track every aircraft near the fleet, regardless of whether they appeared friendly. But perhaps the most lasting lesson was simply this: in the confusion of combat, at the edge of visibility, with exhausted pilots navigating by instinct and hope, even the most basic assumptions, like which carrier you're trying to land on, could be catastrophically wrong. The Japanese pilots who nearly landed on Yorktown that evening escaped into the darkness. Some made it back to their carriers. Others ran out of fuel and vanished into the Pacific. But for those few minutes when they circled an American carrier in the gathering dusk, signaling for permission to land, they came within seconds of making history in the strangest possible way. The landing signal officer who waved them off never learned the identity of the pilot he nearly guided aboard. But somewhere in the darkness of May 7th, 1942, a Japanese aviator realized his mistake just in time, slammed his throttle forward, and flew away from what would have been the most embarrassing landing of his career, assuming he survived it.